It's got to be one of the cheapest cop-outs of all time. The 4 words, 2 out of 3. You've just gotten beaten at the classic game of paper, rock, scissors, and so now it's your turn to take out the garbage. But instead of accepting the globally understood verdict that rock beats scissors, you tell your wife, come on, honey, best 2 out of 3. In other words, you want a second chance. Well, the same thing happens in the world of legal skirmishes. People submit their case to a jury, to the collective wisdom of 12 honest men and women, but then when the results don't come in the way they wanted them to, what do? Even before the bang of the gavel has died down, they announce on the courthouse steps that they're going to appeal. In a landmark decision that went against the Brown and Williamson Tobacco Company, a retired air traffic controller received $750,000 from a Jacksonville, Florida jury that found that the cigarette manufacturers had produced an unreasonably dangerous and defective product, and that they were guilty of failing to warn the customer of the dangers involved in smoking Lucky Strikes for 40 years. Well, the lawyers for the cigarette manufacturers immediately told the world that they would not accept the court's verdict, that they'd take their case to the next level. Now, why mention the 2 out of 3 kind of escapism? Well, we're braving the whitewater rapids of one of the Bible's harder passages. In 1 Corinthians 6, it's difficult to accept Paul's challenge to the followers of Jesus Christ that we shouldn't sue one another, but submit to the arbitration, so to speak, of the church itself. You should be able to handle these things yourselves, he says, almost in a scolding tone. In fact, in verses 2 to 5, he appeals to Christians by pointing out what kind of discernment is going to be required of us someday. Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if you are to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more the things of this life? Therefore, if you have disputes about such matters, appoint as judges even men of little account in the church. I say this to shame you. Is it possible that there is nobody among you wise enough to judge a dispute between believers? Well, that's a heavy passage, isn't it? First of all, points us to a future date beyond the second coming of Christ when righteous people will actually participate in the judgment. Now, of course, the Bible teaches that God is the judge of the universe, but there is a sense in which the redeemed will examine the record books and agree with or validate the divine judgments. True and just are your judgments, the saints declare in Revelation 16:7. They even help pass judgment on the angels, the fallen ones, of course. And with that in mind, Paul asks, how can it be possible that we're not capable of resolving on this earth the differences that arise among us? Even the lowliest among us should be able to do this. Christians should seek to resolve internal disputes because of the radically different foundation of Christian thinking. The church's concept of fairness, forgiveness, morality, and restitution are all foreign to those of a secular court. So Paul tells us, keep these things within the body of Christ, where the mind of Christ is part of the process. In 1 Corinthians 6, verse 6, we discover another powerful motivation for this biblical counsel. After giving his advice, Paul sadly says, instead, one brother goes to law against another, and this is in front of unbelievers. In other words, the presence of a watching world is a compelling argument for not going into the secular court, the secular press, or the blinding TV lights of secular scrutiny with our in-house complaints. The world is watching, Paul tells us. And how does it look to them when one Christian goes to court and sues another? In Richard Dortch's painful book about the PTL crisis, Integrity, How I Lost It, and My Journey Back, We read some of the names that have been etched into our national consciousness. Gorman versus Swaggart, PTL versus Jessica Hahn. And to be fair, we have to confess that every denomination has its X versus Y to sorrow over. Its own Marrakech scandal, as my own church painfully knows. In chapter 5, we included a bit of an essay by C.S. Lewis in which he writes with anguish about the plain, inescapable fact that the world watches our messes with rapt attention. Quoting, "The outer world is quite right to judge Christianity by its results. Christ told us to judge by results. A tree is known by its fruit, or as we say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. When we Christians behave badly, or fail to behave well, we are making Christianity unbelievable to the outside world." End of quote. The reputation issue is so central that it's really the reason Paul goes on in verse 7 to advise us to give up our rights instead of suing. Better to lose, he says. Better to be cheated than to besmirch the cause of Christ. It's interesting to note that Jews didn't permit their disputes to go before Gentile courts. They put their differences to the consideration of approved men of their own faith and nation. In fact, in Acts 18, Gallio, a Roman deputy living in Corinth, knew this, and he refused to hear a case in which Jews accused Paul. "If this were a case involving some crime, I would be obliged to listen to you," he says. "But since it is merely a bunch of questions of semantics and personalities and your silly Jewish laws, you take care of it. I'm not interested, and I'm not touching it." Then he drove them out of the courtroom. Take a look at Acts 18, verses 14 and 15. One commentary observes that Christians who took their differences to heathen tribunals thereby admitted that their communal loyalty to the church was inferior to that of the Jews. Question: are we following the biblical admonitions? In many cases, the body of Christ is being obedient to what God has told us to do. I can read through a magazine such as Christianity Today or Charisma, especially in the news notes section, and read many accounts of where Christian groups have voluntarily submitted their disagreements to arbitration. Some big organizations, even media ministries, have successfully used processes of Christian reconciliation, grievance resolution, binding arbitration, and so on, in order to resolve the inevitable disagreements that happen on a sin-infected planet. It's happened in my churches where I've pastored. In fact, many Christian organizations have in place a corporate policy that follows biblical principles. They have developed ways to receive justice, to have a problem redressed, to have an unchristian leader censured and removed from his or her post. The body of Christ is trying. It really is. Yet the same magazines also report pending lawsuits in secular courts. So-and-so just won a jury award of $500,000 from a Christian college. An employee sues a Christian media ministry and settles for a cash award and back wages. The latter kinds of stories are equally prevalent. Clearly, we as Christians still do fall back on the old cry, wait a minute, 2 out of 3. In the commentary notes for 1 Corinthians 6:7, produced within my own Adventist denomination, I found this keen insight, and I'm quoting: "If a member brings a matter to the church and the church gives its judgment, he should be willing to abide by that judgment, even though he is not satisfied with it. For him to come before the church for adjudication of a matter with a mental reservation that he will abide by the judgment only if it is in his favor is to be guilty of failing to act in harmony with the obvious intent of Paul's counsel." It's difficult to trust that much, isn't it? we find it hard to trust each other, hard to trust our own church, even hard to trust in God Himself. When the Yellow Pages list thousands of eager lawyers and lawsuits. But in the end, could we also observe that the people of God need to draw together before deep chasms form among them? Can't we just get along, Rodney King once asked? Can we live the kinds of holy lives that will begin to melt the huge glacier of animosity that so often exists? Can we behave ourselves so that no one feels the need to sue us?